After all the progress made in the last video, our node network is a little bit of a mess, and I think we can definitely afford to tidy it up a little bit. And that affords us the opportunity to re-examine the network and have a look at the bunches of nodes, the small groups of nodes, their purpose, what they contribute to the network, and we can remove some nodes that we don't need anymore, and others can be bunched together into node groups, just like we did with UV grid and with our fader nodes, to further tidy up the network as much as we can. These nodes were used to create the conical LED shapes, which we're no longer doing, so X to delete them all. I can get rid of this muted divide node, which I used to change the scale, the horizontal scale of the pixels when we introduced a rectangular video. I don't need that anymore. I'm going to press Ctrl and X to delete it and maintain the noodle connections, which now pass directly through straight to the width input as it previously did. Here we have a selection of groups of nodes all carrying out an individual purpose, and a quick explanation of the individual bunches of nodes. This one is our height regulation multiply node and will remain so. This small bunch here softens our edges. If you remember, this transformed a linear scale to a parabolic scale. This greater than node stands on its own and gives us a mask of the outside of our tiles. These nodes created a radial gradient to provide our rounded corners to the tiles. This node, which we're currently not using, was the previous way to combine the two profiles of the tiles, a final minimum node for sharp corners. And this bunch is our horizontal profile, and this our vertical profile of our tile or brick. So we can combine essentially all of this section into a single node, which we'll call a UV brick node, and we can then reuse that node anytime we need to create a tile or brick from a UV map. So let's begin by setting aside the original combination method. I'll set aside the mask node as well. And now I'm going to arrange these nodes, the value distance nodes, into a stack so they're more easily managed essentially. There we go. That's a little tidier. I can keep my soft profile nodes here. I'll put my mask there, and my height regulation multiplication will be the last node of the chain. This separate XYZ node being the first, because this is what will supply our texture coordinates. One thing to do before creating the group is to tie together these noodles and these ones, allowing me to box select everything from the separate XYZ node and its underlying reroutes as far as my height regulation node. And I'll press Ctrl and G to transform everything into a group. And now let's have a look at our inputs and outputs, because it will have made a little bit of a mess, as it usually does. Blender has a very interesting way of figuring out the order in which it wants to display these sockets. It very rarely displays them the way I imagine would make sense, but it's easily fixed and we can easily rearrange them. I'm going to leave the vector at the top of the list. This noodle, which actually, if I show you from the outside, would be technically our X size. This is difficult to tell because I use one value input for both width and height. I'm going to change that for now. This is now my width input and this one my height. So I'll plug this into the height of the UV grid node, and I'll substitute the bottom noodle coming from this value input with this one. This is now my width input. This is now my height. The bottom input is my space input, and the one before the bottom is the edge size input, which I can flip around now, like that. And now I can give them some names. And actually I can see that I'm wrong with the order of the width and height. Look at this. The third value, this one, actually goes to the X component manipulations. So I need to switch the order of these two, and that means I need to swap over these two noodles. There we go. Now, I'll leave vector named as vector. This first value gets called width. The third we'll call height. The fourth is space. And the fifth is edge. Now our two outputs. Let's have a look at what we've got. The result of our greater than node, which we know is our mask, has gone to the top. And the result of our height multiplication node, which we know is our height, has gone to the bottom. I'm going to swap them over, which makes a little more sense to my mind. Height on top and mask on the bottom. And there we go. We have a single, very tidy node group providing our tiles and bricks, as opposed to an endless mess of nodes and noodles down here. Everything is looking much more appealing and, more importantly, much more easy to read. Let's very quickly address these two methods that we have for combining the horizontal and the vertical profiles of our bricks. This one to create sharp corners, and this one to create rounded corners. I'm going to tie together these two noodles so I can easily switch between the two methods of combining the two profiles. Got my rounded corners and I've got my squared corners. And it would be nice to have a way to blend between these two possibilities or switch between the two possibilities like we did with our various correction functions in the UV grid node. We could do that with a mix RGB node. We could drop in a mix RGB and then use that to blend between this result and this result. But I strongly recommend you do not use a mix RGB node for blending values. It will work, the results will be correct. But in terms of performance and the number of calculations you're performing to get the result, the mix RGB is just superfluous, especially considering it is as easy as 3 math nodes, one set to subtract, one set to multiply, and the last set to subtract, to create our own value mix node. Let's grab all these nodes and press Ctrl and G to wrap them all up in their own group. Now, we'll plug the new socket into the top of the first subtract node. We'll plug the second new socket into the bottom of the subtract node. We'll plug the result of the subtract node into the top of the multiply. And now I'm going to create a clamped high precision slider from a mix RGB node. And in fact, I'm going to leave the slider at 0.5 so I get a default of 0.5. Hook that up and delete the mix RGB. I'm going to plug the factor into the bottom of my multiply node. And the final subtract node takes our first input value in the top and the result of the multiply in the bottom. The result of the subtract node goes into the group output. And there you have it. You have just created your own value mix node, which is exactly what I'm going to call it. And I'm going to click my shield to keep this one forever and ever because I use this node so much and you probably will too. Final thing, let's give our values some names. We'll call them value 1 and value 2. Very simple. And now we can use our brand new value mix node to blend between the results of our minimum combiner node and our radial gradient combiner bunch. Just like this. Slide the slider up, you get your rounded corners. Slide it down, you get your pointy corners. How cool is that? Let's do the same thing again with our little bunch of nodes here, which creates our soft edges. Maybe you don't want soft edges. Maybe you want to blend between the soft edges and the sharp edges. We can do that with another value mix node. I'm going to duplicate this one and plug it over here. I'll now plug the result of my value mix node. This is my sharp edge height map into the top of my new value mix node. And the result of the square root being the softened edges into the bottom. And now the result of my new value mix node goes into the top of the height regulation multiply node. You'll see that I can now blend between sharp edges and soft edges with a very handy clamped high precision slider. As always, these sliders must be exposed for use on the outside of the node. And as always, we do that with an input group input node. Remember to observe the value that your slider currently has when you connect it to the new socket, because that will become your default. And in my case, I'm going to leave both of these sliders to 1 because a default of 1 will be suitable. Duplicate that node and bring it over here to create a new factor. And I'll call my first fac round corners. And the second one, soft edges. I'll call node group.002 UV brick. And there we go. Now I can turn off the round corners from the outside. I can turn off the soft edges from the outside. I can increase or decrease the size of the edges themselves, the size of the space around the tiles, and of course the actual size of the tiles themselves. The beauty of this method, which actually stems from using the standard vector output as opposed to the normalized vector output, is that our corners remain perfectly square, perfectly 45 degrees, regardless of elongation either vertically or horizontally. Let's key in some good brick sizes, 0.215 in the width and 0.065 in the height. And we're well on our way to making a very nice procedural bricks texture. Let's reintroduce the correct space size. Let me swap this noodle into the factor output. So now the number input here is the size of space that I get. So if I key in 0.005, there we go. We have 1 centimeter mortar gap around each individual brick. The same thing for my edge fader. I'm going to swap the noodle into the factor. So this value input here represents the size of my edges. Now the edge of a brick will be reasonably small. It will be a number of millimeters, 3 or 4 millimeters. So I'll key in 0.003 for a 3 millimeter edge, maybe a little bigger, 0.004 for a 4 millimeter edge. Turn on my soft edges, turn on my round corners. And now let's set about getting some more interesting textures to draw inside these bricks. There are many resources available online for free PBR texture sets, and Polyhaven just happens to be one of my favorites, and the one I'm going to be using today. Head on over to polyhaven.com, and you'll see they have HDRIs, textures, models, and even more available, all completely for free and for any kind of use without restrictions. It is an excellent website with an excellent ethos and some excellent resources, it's undeniable. Today we're interested in textures, so I'll click here. And now what I want to find is a good bricks texture. So I'll enter brick into the search field right here to see all the bricks textures they have available. And now I need to find a particular type of bricks texture. I need one with all the bricks being of the same size, because what I want to do is to take a texture, something like this, for example, and transform it into a texture atlas, much more like this. You see where the bricks are stacked one on top of the other. They're laid out in a linear grid arrangement as opposed to offset by half. So a texture like this one, for example, where the bricks are of different sizes, won't actually work. I'll have to choose a slightly different one. This is a good looking one right here. And that looks good. All the bricks look of a similar size, so this is definitely something we can work with. So let's come up to the menu in the top right here, and these 4 buttons. Click here to choose the resolution of the images that you want. 2K for me will be fine. Here you can choose the format in which you download your textures. I'm going to choose a zip file. And this menu button on the right, click this to see the available textures and the formats in which you can receive these textures. And I've chosen the AO, diffuse, displacement, and the roughness textures all in the ping format. And I've chosen a normal GL version in EXR format. When you've chosen the textures you want in the correct format, click on download, and you'll get a save dialog where you can choose the place where you want to save your zip file. Wait for the download to complete. Then we can unzip using the extraction program of our choice. I'm using 7-zip in this case. I'll extract here, which gives me this texture folder. And inside I find the textures that I need. I'll select all those textures and press Ctrl-C to copy. come back into the parenting folder and Control V to paste those textures. And now I can delete the textures folder and the zip file. Let me go find those textures. And there they are. Now all we have to do is to bring this texture into Photoshop, or in our case into Blender, and transform this texture into a usable atlas. Let's open a new instance of Blender, select and delete everything. I'll go into Top View and I'll add a plane. Now this plane is of dimensions 2 by 2. I want to set it to 1 by 1. So I'll scale by 0.5 and then press Ctrl and A to apply the scale. Now I'll give this plane a new material. I'll head over to the shader editor, bring up a browser window with my bricks texture inside, and I'm going to drag in the albedo texture. Now I can hold Ctrl and Shift and click on this node to get an emission preview. I'm going to use an Eevee preview for a faster viewport. And now let's head over to the UV editing tab. I'll view my plane from above, from top view, in an Eevee preview. Now let's go into edit mode, and I want to divide this plane into as many tiles as there are bricks in my texture. So I can quickly count them: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 bricks horizontally. So I can divide my plane 4 times. And there are 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14 bricks vertically. So I'll subdivide my plane 13 times. And there we have it. Now I'll select all the tiles together, and I can move my UV map around so there is no spill at the edges of the texture. Essentially what I'm doing is I want to arrange these lines so they match with the center of the mortar lines of the texture as much as possible. It won't be perfect because the bricks aren't perfect, but let's do what we can. Something like that should be okay. Now we should address each alternating row of bricks, the ones which are offset by 0.5. To fix them, I'm going to select the leftmost tile in a row and then hold Control and click on the rightmost tile, and that'll select all of the tiles in between. I can now do the same for all the offset rows. Now I can grab all of the UV tiles and drag them along until the mortar matches with the lines of the UV map. Again, it won't be perfect, but do it as best you can. And now we can go in and address each individual brick, starting with the ones which look particularly bad. Here, for example, I'm going to select the individual vertices and move them along slightly until the mortar matches with the lines. If you're having trouble seeing the mortar because of this orange selection color, you can turn that off. Here, under Mesh Edit Mode, deselect Faces, and you'll still have the yellow outline, but you won't have the yellow color covering the tile, so you can more easily see what's going on underneath. Let's go along the line and drag all of these vertices into place so our mortar looks good. For the next line, we'll do exactly the same. Zoom in a little bit to see what you're doing. And move the vertices along so they lie in the middle of the mortar lines between the bricks. Remember, if you're moving the end vertices, to select both the left and right, or top and bottom, vice versa, but select both of those vertices and move them in the same way, because they must match to maintain the tiling of the texture. So I've selected both the left and the right, and I can drag that along until I see some more mortar there at the edge here. Same over here. We seem to have a lot more mortar on the right, so I can reduce that a little bit. And now I'm going to do the same thing for all the rows of tiles, so I'll speed this section of the video up, and I'll see you in a few minutes. And there we go, that looks pretty good. We've transformed our bricks texture into a bricks atlas, which UV Grid can read and use a lot better. And the beauty of this method is that now we can go into the shader editor and simply swap out the albedo texture for our roughness, ambient occlusion, normals, etc., etc. And the subdivision and grid layout will maintain for the other textures, meaning we can bake them all out in series. And to bake them out, we add a camera. I'm going to raise it up by 1 and remove all rotation. Change the type to orthographic with a scale of 1. And now I'll set the resolution of my blend file to 2048 by 2048, as my texture is a 2K texture. I can now render with very few samples because this is an emission shader with no world lighting. As a matter of fact, let me make sure that the world lighting is turned off. In fact, it isn't. There we go. Finally, under Render Properties, Color Management, make sure the View Transform is set to Standard and the Look is set to None. Now we can render out that texture, done in the blink of an eye, and our albedo texture is ready to go. Let's switch to Render Slot 2. I'm going to go back to my shader editor, bring up the browser window again, and drag in the other textures that I need. I have my AO texture, roughness, bump, and finally the normal map. Where is the normal map? There it is. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I'm missing something. The bump map shouldn't be there. That's from a different texture set. I'll delete that. And what I actually need is the displacement texture. There it is. So now, to bake out my AO, all I do is Shift, Control, and click on the AO node. I get my AO preview. I can render out the AO. Again, done in the blink of an eye. Same for the roughness. Into slot 3, render, etc., etc. Repeat this process for all your other textures. Save your atlases in a safe location for later use in Blender. And now let's set about using our atlases to create some procedural bricks materials. Now back to Blender and our UV grid node. Let's get rid of this image texture node and the mix RGB nodes because we don't need them anymore. I'll move the UV grid setup here in a little bit closer. And now I'll bring up a browser window so I can drag in my newly created atlases. I've got my albedo, AO, there's my roughness. Now I'll take height and finally the normals. Make sure that the roughness, height, and normal textures are all set to non-color mode. I'm going to drop in a temporary UV map node so I can connect it to these image textures, which will allow me to tie the noodles together and delete the UV map. Now to set up the image textures, this is how I do it. I'll begin with the albedo and the AO. I combine them with a mix RGB, set to multiply. Now the roughness and the height textures, I separate their color values into 3 components and only use one of them. I'll duplicate this separate RGB node and connect the height texture to it. Finally, the normal map texture needs a vector normal map node. Finally, we'll need a way to control the height map, so I'll add a fader node. Similarly, I'll connect the red channel of my roughness texture to the roughness input of the principled shader, and the result of my mix RGB goes into the base color. We can now see our PBR texture being represented correctly in cycles with shading and lighting as you would expect. To get a better idea of the contribution of the height map, more to the point how high the height map actually is, I'm going to remove the color and roughness information, make the base color a little lighter. I'm actually also going to remove the normal map. So when I roll to 0, I get no bump at all. Now I'm going to slowly introduce it until it looks a suitable height for a brick wall of this type. That looks pretty good. 0.028, let's call it 0.03. Now reconnect the normal map, the roughness, and the color results. And now we can use UV grid to split this atlas apart and draw it in the brick wall fashion that we created earlier. We'll do that by first turning off the preview. Now I'll use the normalized output connected to the texture coordinates of all of my textures here. And if you remember before, let me remove that noodle for now. If you remember, the atlas in terms of the number of cells is 5 horizontally by 14 vertically. So let me hook up the normalized output again. I'm going to drop in a vector math node set to multiply. And into the x component, I'm going to enter 1 divided by 5 for 5 horizontal cells. And into the y component, 1 divided by 14. And now we should see one brick being tiled over and over again, but being correctly offset as we want, which we can actually change now as well. So while we are in effect using PBR textures, we are drawing them procedurally. So this material could be called a semi-procedural material if you like. But clearly now we need to add some random variation to the selection of brick that gets drawn. We'll do that with the random color output. We're going to plug it into a vector math node. We're going to keep these values from the multiply node down here, but we'll set the operation to snap. And now we'll use a third vector math node to add the result of our snap to the output of our multiplied texture coordinates. Preview. And there we have it. We've got randomly selected bricks being selected procedurally, drawn procedurally, but with the detail of previously made PBR texture sets. We can still use our settings here to change the size of the bricks if we want to. The textures will get somewhat stretched, obviously. We can change the offset. And all those procedural functions still work, but you'll notice we've done nothing so far with our UV brick node. So let's move on to that. Back to Polyhaven for some more texture sets, but this time we're not looking for a complete bricks texture. I'm looking for some flatter textures to add surface details to my mortar and to my bricks. UV grid will provide the bricks, and I want some PBR textures to provide some small surface detail. So I'll do a search for concrete this time, and I'm going to choose concrete floor 01, which will work very well for my mortar. And I'll choose rough plaster brick 5, which will give us some excellent surface detail for our bricks. I've already downloaded these textures. You should go ahead and download and extract them as we did before. And now we'll head over to Blender. The first thing to do is to remove our Atlas textures and our Atlas coordinate setup, which is no longer useful to us. And now we can drag in our new textures, beginning with the granular concrete texture, albedo, AO, roughness, displacement, and the normals. I'll line all my nodes up and hook them up as I did before. I can now preview my texture set. Looking good. I'm going to use a displacement setup to get a better idea of the contribution of the height map and what value I should set it to right here. So I'll remove the normals, connect my height map to the height input of my displacement node to the material output, and turn on my subdivision. I'm actually going to use adaptive subdivision for a lot more detail, so I can see the very small bumps in this map. And that already looks quite good. Maybe I could turn it down to 0.02. Also looks good. We'll go for a happy medium of 0.025. And that'll work well. Okay, let's remove the displacement setup temporarily. And we'll give these nodes a UV map. I'll then collapse and stack these nodes to make them a little tidier. a little something like that. This is actually the height control for this particular height map, so I'll bring that up to this bunch as well. And now I'll remove all these connecting noodles to make some room, so I can drag in my second texture set, which is the rough plaster brick set right here. Drag in the diffuse AO, etc., etc. Tidy them up, get them all in line, and hook them up like I did before. Mix RGB, set to multiply for the diffuse and the AO. We need separate RGB nodes for roughness and for height. The height will also need a control node. I'll use a fader. The normal map goes directly into the normal map node. Height map into the height of the bump node. Roughness to roughness, and the multiply result into the base color. Set the color space of the roughness and the height textures to non-color. The normal map is already set correctly because it was imported as an EXR file, so it's correctly set to linear by Blender. I can now preview this texture set, and that immediately looks like the displacement is much too strong. In fact, it's set to 0.5. So again, I'm going back to a displacement setup. I need a very clear indication of how far my height map is displacing the vertices. And that's not going to work. Let's turn that way down, 0.02, for example. Let's see what it looks like. That looks better. Still possibly a little too much for the surface of a brick. 0.015. That'll work. I'll leave it like that for now. I might reduce that furthermore, but we'll see. Let's remove the displacement. Actually, let's remove all connecting noodles. I'm going to move my principled shader and the normal map and bump nodes a little over to the right. I'll hook these nodes up to a temporary UV map and collapse and stack them. Excellent, so now we have our two PBR texture sets ready to be combined and blended between. And how we blend between them, we'll see in just 1 second. For now, let me preview the bricks surface output. So now, how do we use UV grid to transform this concrete texture into some bricks? The first thing we'll do, as we've done before with our face textures, is to add the random color to our UV map very simply. The vector math node set to add, drop in the random color, and look at that. We've already got something vaguely brick looking. Let me restore my sizes here, 0.215 in the width and 0.065 in the height. And speaking of height, now I can add the height result of my UV brick node to the height output of my surface detail height map right here. That is a simple matter of a math node set to add, and the height output of the UV brick goes into the bottom. And there you go. We're getting some very nice looking bricks here. I'm going to go back to displacement. I'm going to turn off adaptive subdivision for now. Turn on my subdivision surface modifier. And there we go. We're well on our way to creating some very, very nice looking bricks. Very rough looking bricks. To make the bricks extend from the surface a little bit more, I'm going to add a control fader node, which takes the mask of the bricks in the value input. I'll drag the slider down to 0, and I can then add the result of this fader node to the height output of my UV brick, and that allows me to further displace the actual bricks from their surface without affecting their edges or the space around them. Set it to 0.03, for example. And now we need a height value to attribute to our mortar setup right here. And then we can compare the height of the mortar to the height of the brick and see which one comes through at any given pixel. So we'll do that with a math node set to less than. The height of our mortar goes into the top and the height of our bricks goes into the bottom. And that will now give me a mask of everywhere where the brick is higher than the mortar. Speaking of the height of the mortar, I'll need a little bit more control than just the size of the noise of the mortar. I need a base level for the mortar as well. For that, I'll use another fader node, so I'll duplicate this one. Set the factor to 0 and the value input to 1. Now I can add the result of my surface noise height map to my base height value. And now I can control the height of the mortar, even though you can't see it in the preview, because I haven't combined the two layers just yet. So we have a mask which will show us where the bricks are higher than the mortar, and we'll use that as the mix factor for a set of mix nodes, both color mix and value mix, to blend between the various results of our texture sets. And that'll look a little something like this. I'm going to drop in a mix RGB node and delete all these connecting noodles for now. I can actually turn off the preview. I'll need a value mix node, which I'll duplicate because I'm going to need a second one, and then I'll duplicate my color mix node because I'll need 2 of those as well. Now then, the color result from both of my sets into the top and the bottom of the first mix node. The roughness result from the mortar set goes into the top of the first value mix, and the roughness of the brick surface into the bottom. Next, we'll connect the final combined height output of the sets, mortar into the top, bricks into the bottom, and finally, our normal maps, mortar in the top, bricks in the bottom, as always. Now, the result of our less than node right here controls the mix factors of all of these nodes. Now I can hook the results of the various blends to my principal shader into base color, roughness, height, and my normal map. And now when I preview, I can zoom in a little, and you'll see that as I increase the base value for my mortar height, the mortar starts to fill up the gaps, coming ever closer to the surface, where it actually overtakes and spills over onto the faces of the bricks. We can completely hide the bricks if we want to. Reduce the mortar a little again, have the bricks come through. This height blending method is so good for combining PBR textures, which often include a height texture, really blending 2 textures together with the minuscule surface details by using the less than or greater than operation is such a satisfying technique. I love how when the mortar spills over the edges, it looks so real. This wall looks like a blend of a very old set of bricks, I suppose, with a recently built wall because of the spilling over of the mortar. One way or the other, we now have some very nice looking procedural bricks. And though we have created the surface details with PBR textures, these bricks are procedural. We can increase the sizes as we wish. Let me remove the displacement setup for a second. We'll go for an Eevee preview. And now you can very clearly see me increase and decrease the sizes of the bricks. There's no texture stretching whatsoever. The random functions still work. I can change the random seed to change the layout of the bricks. And coming back down to my UV brick node, I can still increase and decrease the mortar space around the bricks. I can increase the sizes of the edges of the bricks themselves, making them much more rotund. And you can now build your bricks texture exactly the way you like it. If you don't like the texture sets, swap them out. All you have to do is remove these textures to replace them with another 5 PBR textures from any given set. And you can create any kind of bricks you want. If you can find the textures, you can make it work. The next step would be to remove the PBR textures entirely and only use procedural noise functions to create all this surface detail. but that is a much longer tutorial, much more involved, and most certainly for another time. For now, I'm going to leave this material as it is. And that'll do it for this video. It's been a long one, much longer than usual, so if you made it this far, please let me know down in the comments. If you found the video useful, please leave a like, and if you'd like to see more content like this, consider subscribing to the channel. And I'll see you in the next video. Take it easy.